Are we safe? We are safer. Are we absolutely safe? No, I think the marathon bombing would highlight that.
I just think it's a really interesting debate as to who you really care reads your stuff. This is the trade-off of contemporary living.
This goes back to Louis Brandeis, who looked at wiretapping and said, look at this, you can do wiretapping without invading anybody's property interests.
Where do you draw the line between your privacy and your safety? When is it okay for the government to spy on people? Well, this is an issue that's dominated headlines in recent weeks, and tonight on the Aspen Institute Presents, we'll take an in-depth look at exactly what measures are reasonable when it comes to our safety. Hi, I'm John Stewart from the BBC, on location for World Channel at the 2013 Aspen Ideas Festival here in Aspen, Colorado. And it's been a remarkable week with a host of influential panelists taking on issues that affect all our lives. There's perhaps no issue more important than the line between our safety and our privacy. In our first session, we'll hear from national security experts about what the government is doing to keep us safe and whether we have the right to know that we're being watched.
Some of the complexity about the question, of course, is due to just time, place, and comparison. You know, safe compared to where, safe compared to when, and some of the complexity is due to the difference between the perception and emotion, you know, what fear we have about our security, and the physical reality of just how safe we are. Some things may in fact be quite safe, but we're fearful of them. We all know many people who don't like to fly, yet they have no problem driving to the airport, which is a much more dangerous kind of activity. And of course, there are, and we'll be talking about these, I hope, the trade-offs that inevitably exist between safety and liberty. Trade-offs really relating to the kind of society that we want to live in. We might be a lot safer in the physical sense, of course, if we had armed guards at every corner and in every schoolyard and metal detectors at every entrance and cameras everywhere and all of our communications intercepted. But I don't think any of us would want to live in a society like that. But there are those trade-offs, and I think at different times we as a country come to different points on that spectrum. Congress has taken many steps in the last decade relating to this question. The Patriot Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the Protect America Act, others, many others. The Department of Homeland Security is a decade old. So I wonder if you could just start by telling us how well you think they have worked and whether they've made us safer. Do we have the right overall strategy for this challenge?
Actually, Congress's role in crafting some security measures that have made us safer is a good one. Some of you may be stunned to hear this, but I actually believe it. And of course, I'm totally objective since I played a major role in this. But I was there on 9/11 walking toward the Capitol of the United States when I got news about the two planes hitting the trade towers. And guess what Congress did? We closed the Capitol and evacuated all the buildings. Huge mistake. On a day when America was so vulnerable, we thought about protecting ourselves first. And that was a bad story. Later that day, the buildings were reopened. We stood hand in hand. This really happened. You can check it out. And sang, God Bless America. But since then, Congress, by and large, has played a pretty constructive role here. The reason that Mike McConnell was the Director of National Intelligence is that Congress reorganized our intelligence community in 2004 and created this office, which is a joint command over 16 intelligence agencies, the point of which was to try to improve the way we do intelligence so we could connect the dots. And the DNI's responsibility is to do that, is to leverage the strength of the different intelligence agencies and build one hopefully accurate picture of what our future and what the threats against America are. So that was positive, and I believe. And intelligence reform is a work in progress, but I think as we go through the years, current director Jim Clapper is doing a very good job, Of course, I serve on his advisory committee, so again, I'm totally objective. But by and large, that's worked well. We also insisted that one of the programs that's now fully disclosed, this terrorist surveillance program, which was first implemented by the Bush administration outside of the law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, be brought under FISA. And FISA was amended in 2008. Congress was involved to create safeguards around how this law works. Some of you may disagree with it, and I think we should have a public debate about whether we need this kind of collection of metadata, both for telephone calls and emails and other forms of communication. But I believe something that's now been disclosed, which is that this collection of stuff has thwarted a large number of attacks against our country. And when you look at it, at least the way I add, there have been 5 small-scale attacks that have had some foreign nexus. The Boston bomber episode might go in that package, but there have been 53 or more that have been thwarted. So let me say, so I think that works pretty well. But finally, let me say this. There is no such thing as 100% security. It is impossible, and everyone should understand this and become more resilient, the way the Israelis are.
Mike, from an executive branch perspective, I'd just like you to tell us generally how you think, how well we are prepared to deal with acts of domestic terror. In Boston, there seemed to be a great degree of coordination, cooperation, and good communication among federal, state, and local officials, better than it might have been earlier. But from an overall perspective, how well do you think we are doing?
For our defense or protection against domestic. Terrorism, I think we're significantly better than we were when 9/11 occurred, much better at sharing information and cooperation and so on. The laws that Jane mentioned have had dramatic impact. Now, I have a particular point of view about living inside the executive branch where authorities and responsibilities overlap or touch. It generates friction, and there tends to be a lack of information sharing and so on. Well, a lot of these laws put in place require you to do that. So the way I would answer the question is, are we safe? We are safer. Are we absolutely safe? No, I think the marathon bombing would highlight that. The challenge for those of us in the portion of the contribution that I grew up in is to morph into, to change and to prepare for next. There's an old saying in the military that every general is preparing to fight the last war, not the next war. And that's true of generally of bureaucracies. So the challenge for our community, and I think with the Congress creating the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, you don't have allegiance to a particular agency. You're supposed to be looking over the horizon, trying to determine what's next.
Jim, is it possible that the so-called war on terror has actually made us feel less safe than we should feel? And might it be, as I said, 12 years after 9/11, 10 years after Homeland Security Department, that we think of domestic terrorism the way we think of crime? I mean, no one expects, the police to stop all of crime. So, and as you said too, I mean, two guys with access to the internet and, poisonous ideas were able to create mayhem. So what about this war on terror, and is that the right way to look at domestic violence, mass violence, indiscriminate violence?
As you know, and I know because we've both written on this topic, we may have different points of view from many people in the audience here. 7 years ago, I wrote a cover story in the Atlantic arguing that it was time to declare an end to the war on terror and declare victory, that we were being distorted too much by thinking about terrorism too much. And there were ways to deal with the absolute level of threat without all the all the corresponding problems in our that we are creating for ourselves. I was thinking of 2 anecdotal illustrations of this. I mean, ways to illustrate there's no objective way to talk about whether you're safe or not. one of the things I do in my line of work is get proposals for magazine articles or book blurbs or whatever. Somebody sent me a proposal this morning for a new book about how to make people feel calmer about taking commercial airline flights. And the introduction said, while statistics show that the risk of dying on a commercial airline flight is like 1 in 63 billion, that's not enough for cognitive safety among many people. So there's nothing you can feel really safe about. But I would argue that a principle that all students of terrorism over the decades and centuries have observed, which is the damage is not the attack, it's the reaction it provokes. That we've found ways to make that, that we have walked into that by magnifying the effect of terrorism, magnifying the fear we feel internally. Certainly the classic example for here, this is the assassination that touched off World War I. One person was able to kill 20 million people or so with the reaction he provoked. I would argue that even the 9/11 attacks, which were a hideous act of destruction on our land, were more damaging to the U.S. through the reaction than the event itself, the reaction of the subsequent 10 years of warfare that we decided to undertake. And so therefore, I think the task of becoming resilient, as my favorite congressman from California, Jane Harman, said, is that involves deciding to dampen down and minimize the attacks that will continue to occur. And I think the news media have been guilty of ramping everything up, and the political establishment has been too. So if the news media and the political establishment could make us, could thicken our skin, people are going to be killed in car crashes while we're here. They'll be killed in murders while we're here. We're not going to talk about them. Somebody will be killed in a terrorist attack in the next year, and we should not go crazy about it.
Yeah, we'll probably come back to that.
Could I just add
please.
one thing to that, and that is, I thought our reaction to the Boston Marathon bombing was excellent. Country, you deserve credit for that. It was wall to wall on TV for days, and all communities in the country didn't go into lockdown. And the search for these guys was done competently and appropriately by an integrated group of law enforcement, which had practiced for this. Unfortunately, didn't prevent it, but practiced for the response. And so I think we are becoming more resilient. And my one last comment on this, the war on terror has always been a misnomer. Terror is a tactic. It's not an enemy. And by that phrase has inflamed the Muslim community. Not all terrorists are Muslim, in case anyone missed it. But that's how they hear it, which again generates a response that creates more terror. So we need to think about this. And we should never have used it.
Let's just stay on that about inflaming. And you just gave some pretty good grades to some policies of the government. Is it possible that some of our policies, in fact, do more to recruit terrorists than stop them? Drones, Guantanamo Bay?
Yes.
Pick anyone you like.
Yeah. Are we generating more attacks than we are taking steps to stop them? That was a Rumsfeld question. And I think sometimes the answer to that is yes. The tactics we're using, to my mind, have a place in a toolbox against terror attacks, but we haven't explained the strategy of when we're going to use them and what we stand for effectively. And so some people think our foreign policy is drone attacks. And if they think that, whether they live in the US or they live in Somalia, or they live in some outskirt of someplace in Yemen, they form an impression of us which generates more terrorists.
Jim, I want to come back to you, and you talked about the responsibility of the media and leaders, and I want to talk about a different aspect about the responsibility of the media, and that is what the responsibility is, if at all, to keep national security information secret when leakers hand it to you on a silver platter. And I wonder, would The Atlantic have published as The Guardian did?
Let me first explain that the general approach and then the specific case. Whenever there is classified or sensitive information that as a journalist you receive, there's always a trade-off that's involved here. And let's use one extreme. Suppose somebody gave you information about the Osama bin Laden raid, an hour, 24 hours before it happened, 6 hours before it happened. The harm you could do by publishing that information, you would know, would vastly outweigh the good you might do in transparency. Because there always is harm if there are real-time operations, and so every test case in the ethics classes for journalism, yes, they exist. involves, who are you hurting by publishing this information? So we do recognize that there is harm to somebody that when you're revealing a secret. Usually things are secret for some kind of reason. Maybe a bogus reason, but there's some reason why it originally was secret. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things where you think there is some public value by making the information known. When I was still in college, working on the college newspaper, there was this guy who showed up in the hanging around with the students in the upstairs loft of the newspaper room, and he had this gigantic stack of papers that he wanted help photocopying because it was a big problem to do. That was Daniel Ellsberg. And so, and the argument, the government at that time was dead set against him, having to peg on papers. You recall the Supreme Court case, but it seemed to me then and now that the benefit in making that information known far outweighed the damage to ongoing operations in Vietnam or whatever the Vietnamese or the Soviets or the Chinese might know about U.S. intentions. My view, which I suspect my friend Mike McConnell might disagree with, is that there was enough benefit in public recognition, public debate about these programs to justify some publication. So I'm agnostic about the person himself. He seems to be a very weird person. I stipulate there may be real damage from some of this. My perspective is there is benefit to the public in knowing these programs are going on.
I will actually,
Yes.
Mike will not be surprised that I am going to follow up on this.
Could I just respond?
Please, please.
Let me use a historical example to make my case here. In World War II, we were breaking Nazi Germany codes and reading the orders to the field commanders before the German field commanders. Now, the historians have written about this, and they've indicated it probably shortened global conflict anywhere from 18 months to 2 years. So now, I would challenge a journalist to say, if you had that information, in the interest of transparency, would you have made it public?
Could I just add one thing to make it? I mean, I think that the question is who decides.
Right.
Not everything that we classify should be classified.
Agreed.
The executive branch is overclassified forever. The reasons you classify, the only reasons you should classify are to protect sources and methods. Therefore, if that really happens and classified material leaks, people die and our capability going forward is compromised. That's what classification is for. Obviously, it's broadly used to protect turf, to protect people from embarrassment, and that's a problem we have to solve. But I would just put something out there before Jim answers, and that is, it leaked that Osama bin Laden, about 10 years before we got him, was using an Intelsat phone. Right. So it was published that he was using a cell phone that we were able to track. Yeah. What did he do? He stopped using cell phones and started using couriers, and nobody has missed how long it took to find the guy through the courier or the chain of couriers. And so we lost a lot of capability, and I feel the same way about the Stuxnet virus. Won't disclose who was doing that, but it's certainly been in the press that happened. I think that has compromised our capability to interfere with and slow down the development of nuclear weapons by countries that I believe threaten our allies and us. So bad that that's been in the press. And on this leak, again, it was in the press 7 years ago. These programs, all the folks who are saying, I'm shocked, I didn't know. This was in the press in 2005 and 2006, and it caused Congress, that was when it occurred to some of us, that the administration wasn't following FISA, to amend FISA to bring all of this stuff under strict safeguards with a federal court reviewing this stuff and Congress being more fully
Jim, do you mind
informed.
a comment before I go back to Mike?
Sure. So I will comment on 3 brief planes. Point 1, I certainly agree with Mike's proposition. There are times when they're of operational sensitivity. Of course, the press in most nations will recognize the importance of guarding information. In World War II, I'm sure there are people in the press of both the U.S. and the U.K. who understood the Coventry bombing, where Churchill allowed Coventry to be bombed rather than revealed they'd broken the German code. Same with Yamamoto and his codes with Japan. I wrote a book called Breaking the News, in which one part was about whether an American news unit in Vietnam that saw an American platoon about to be ambushed, would they have any duty to warn them or not? So I think people in the press, even in the press, we recognize this. Point Two would be to say, yes, when it comes to information surveillance, we recognize the concept with Stuxnet, with the Osama bin Laden leak, that changed behavior. I think the belief in the press is that most of these leaks actually they are usually voluntarily given either by executive branch or legislative branch people. That's, as you probably know too. In this, now if we come to the instant case of this guy Snowden, whose motives we don't know, the benefit, so the harm is knowledge that information broadly is being collected more than many people recognized. It seemed to me that every spy movie, spy thriller, and documentary of the past 10 years has turned on this basic plot point. You don't use cell phones. You know, Osama bin Laden lived in a compound because they knew that something like this was happening, and yet the public wasn't debating the actual programs because they weren't brought to attention. The president has said it's good we're having this debate. We wouldn't have it without this episode, it seems to me.
Let me just go back to Mike. Obviously, I know you can't talk about the Snowden investigation itself, but what about the debate that his actions have sparked about security and privacy? And do you think where do you think that'll take us as a nation? And might there be changes coming from this debate that are actually good?
Well, let me answer by saying I think debate is good. Now, let me give you a sort of a simplistic way, at least I think about this, and I'm going to go to the Constitution of the United States. 3 articles. There are only 3 articles in the Constitution. First is a Congress, 2 basic jobs: raise money, appropriate money, and then tell us how we can spend it. That's the basic job of Congress. The Article 2 is the president. First responsibility is protect the United States, its interests, its citizens, and its allies. And the 3rd article is for the judicial branch. So when I was asked to come back as DNI, probably no one would be aware in this room, I tried to amend FISA as the director of the National Security Agency in 1992. Now the reason I did is because the guy tried to relieve it and to revive it and improve it in 1988 because it was out of date. I mean, technology had passed it by. It was tried a couple of other times. So when I came into the government, I had guilty knowledge that we have to change this law. Here's the circumstance. A terrorist in Pakistan, this is real, a terrorist in Pakistan coordinating with a terrorist in Turkey to blow up a U.S. facility in Germany, foreigner to a place in a foreign country, and where the only place my community had access was in the United States. And the reason is most communications flow through the United States. The law said I had to have a warrant. Now, those terrorists have 100 email accounts. They move around, they change. So if I get a warrant, that takes time. It takes people off the job to write up the warrant. So what I pleaded with the Congress to do, which my colleague here helped me do, was let's change the law to say as long as we're collecting foreign intelligence, it's appropriate regardless of where or how we intercept it. That was the basic change in FISA.
Booz Allen Hamilton has become an example, in part through this, for the government outsourcing of security functions. And part of the Snowden debate is about whether that's a good idea. And obviously you support the work Booz Allen does in this area, and I just wonder if you think the country should support that work.
My belief is, when I look out at Department of Defense, having served there for 30 years, we're the best in the world. We are the best in the world. We can go anywhere and accomplish just about any mission. Everything we use is made in the private sector. Ships, airplanes, submarines, ammunition, that's all manufactured in the private sector. So there's some element of bringing the best and brightest of the free market innovation, creativity, new ideas in to equip those of us in the military or whatever function we have in government to carry out our duties in the most productive way. So in the way I think about it, if you take away the ability of the government to harness the private sector, it would do serious harm to our collective interest.
Let me ask one other question relating to this, which you may or may not be able to answer, and that's the simple one, as how the people at Booz Allen Hamilton feel about Snowden having been a fellow employee.
Let me just say that if you will read General Alexander's description of the harm and how he feels about what he calls a traitor, at least those that I talk to in my company reflect a similar point of view. Now, remember what Alexander said. This has caused irrevocable harm to our ability to protect the country.
Jane, I want to come back. I think it was Mike who said about how we're fighting, sometimes we fight the last war. And I wonder if you think we've focused disproportionately on aviation security since 9/11, fighting the proverbial last war. And by contrast, and we're talking about how safe we are, how safe are we by way of contrast at our seaports, mass transit, stadiums, theaters, soft targets? Are we still fighting the last war as we go through all those screens at the airports?
Well, the TSA process is analog. You all know that, and those little boxes are sometimes ridiculous. But aviation is a place that Al-Qaeda has said historically over the years, and still says, it wants to attack. And so I do see aviation as a vulnerability, and we have made it much, much safer. We have layered security at airports, and again, some of it you don't see, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because you shouldn't see it. But there are many different things that you have to go through to get on an airplane, including having your name in advance go through a database, which, if we do the database right, and sometimes we don't, should at least require you to go through some kind of secondary check. So I am for aviation security, and I again think the TSA model should be revised. We should talk to our friends the Israelis, who do a much better job of screening passengers without all that stuff. On the other areas, we have done a much better job of maritime security. Congress passed a law, which I co-authored a few years back, which again requires layered security at ports of entry, especially for goods. I mean, think about dirty bombs coming in through ports. There are not only sensors now, which are a mixed bag because they have false positives, but at the point of embarkation, the stuff in containers is checked, and there are all kinds of ways those containers are secured on the high seas. So it'd be very hard, not impossible, for people to get bad stuff into our country. So we're doing better there. Are we doing better on borders? Well, again, I think I've been watching this debate on immigration. I don't think building a fence across the southern border is going to make us safer from terrorists. Most of them have not tried to enter that way. The few that have entered our country through borders have come in more from Canada than Mexico, but hey, I guess it gets votes at home or something.
Almost all terrorist type events here have been one-off, lone wolf, angry person with unlimited and easy access to incredibly high-powered explosives, guns, unlimited ammunition, untraceable. And it just seems to me that a lot of the conversation and a lot of the animation that's going on about maintaining the war on terror in our country is coming from the very same people in Congress who are focused on maintaining the status quo in terms of people having access to those guns, weapons of mass destruction, at a time when the state-sponsored terror, since 9/11, essentially has not been an issue. So it's sort of a spinoff on the fighting the last war thing, but I was just wondering, I mean, Gabby Giffords is going to be here. She's my congresswoman, and I was on my way to see her the day she was shot and 6 people were killed in Tucson. And this was a kid who went into a Walmart, bought a gun and multi-capacity magazines like he was buying a Snickers, and walked right up and shot a whole bunch of people before anyone, even if they had a gun, could have done anything about it. So I would like to get your reaction to that, and why are we talking about this when this no longer seems to be the main problem right now?
Well, I think they're both huge problems, and I had an F- rating from the NRA as a member of Congress. It's the only F- I ever got in my life. And I think easy access to guns and explosives is a bad thing. Fortunately, the explosives part is being reduced. It is very hard to buy the right kind of explosives to build a fertilizer bomb like Timothy McVeigh used in the last century to take down an office building in Oklahoma. But the guns piece is absolutely right. And there are lots of people who are self-radicalized who are not Muslim. Some of them are Muslim, but they're radicalized for other reasons, or they're nuts who can walk into any place and shoot it up. And that is, to me, completely unacceptable. And it was a tragedy when Congress punted on the easiest piece of legislation it could have passed to to reduce gun violence. We don't need to talk about gun control, which scares people to death. I'm not against talking about it. But reducing gun violence does require, it seems to me, having a database of people who shouldn't own guns.
But one thing I also was going to ask that we haven't talked about, the risk of bioterrorism, loose nukes, I mean, these other potentially catastrophic things. Should those be keeping us up at night? We're trying to find ways to sleep better, but should they be?
Well, I'll go back to my comment about fighting the last war, not the next war. Those of us in the community spent a lot of our time worried about extremist groups making efforts to get biochemical or nuclear weapons. You add cyber to that, and you can say instead of weapons of mass destruction, it'd be maybe weapons of mass disruption. But there's a concerted effort to see it, understand it, track it, have some awareness of it. But it's not something that's been used in a demonstrable way that people can react to it, other than what's been released in Syria, apparently at a
Very limited.
some limited level. But that is a huge, huge problem. With the right kind of bioweapon, you could do significant damage.
Communities practice for this. That's the good news. And the less good, and there are quarantine practices that most communities, first responders in communities, would know how to deploy in the event of some of this stuff. Most people, well, believe that it would be hard to mount a large-scale bioattack, but it's certainly not impossible. It's also possible to make dirty bombs from materials already in the United States. Let's understand, it's not just catching nuclear materials outside, and I'm not going to make some suggestions of what somebody could do, because I don't want to put any good ideas out there for bad guys.
We're out of time.
But,
so you can't
okay, we're out of time. But
No,
but
to do that.
The last point is, a lot of this, in terms of putting vaccines in appropriate places, vaccinating people against things that could happen, then comes the question of immunity in case something goes wrong. And Congress has punted every time it has considered legislation that would protect those who are trying to protect us in advance of possible attacks. So if we're closing on a really cheery note, the United States Congress, I would like people to think that it has done a lot of things after 9/11 right, but there is a huge unfinished agenda, and it's up to all of you to bug your members of Congress mercilessly to solve these problems rather than just point fingers.
Mike, please.
A cheerier note, you're living in the safest nation on earth, the safest nation in the history of the world. And the reason it works is because of dialogue like this and citizens who vote, who make those congressmen do the right stuff. And so engagement and dialogue is how we say where we are with the right values, and we are the shining example to the rest of the world.
The question of privacy versus safety is one that went all the way to the US Supreme Court this year. And speakers at the 2013 Ideas Festival included Supreme Court Justices Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. Justice Kagan talked about the court's recent decisions with law professor Jeffrey Rosen.
And the question is, can the police bring a dog onto your front porch without consent and have it alert to drugs and then go in your house without a warrant? And Justice Scalia said no, because it's a trespass. Your porch is part of your private property. But you wrote a separate concurrence. First of all, you have this amazing way of seizing the audience's attention by speaking directly to us. And you said something like, imagine the dog comes onto your front porch. Would you think that was a trespass? Yes, you would. And would you think that was an invasion of your privacy? Yes, you would think that too, you said. You sort of grabbed our attention that way. Tell us what it was that you thought needed to be said in addition about why in an electronic age, privacy has to be protected not just by property rights, but also by expectations of privacy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you said in an electronic age. In a way, this was a very old school kind of case. You know, it was about dog sniffing, which is a kind of law enforcement technique that has existed for many decades. But at the same time, it's really quite connected to a lot of the newer Fourth Amendment issues that we have started to deal with and that we're going to continue to be dealing with. This is going to be, I think, a growth industry for the court. You know, the next decade, I think we're going to have many of these cases. And there was a lot of similarity between this case about the dog coming up to your front porch and sniffing and a case that we had last year, which was about GPS, the use of GPS surveillance. And there, the police officer had put like a card on a car and then had been able to track the movements of that car every minute of every day for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the question was very much the same. was that could the police do that without any kind of warrant, without even probable cause? And in both cases, Justice Scalia wrote and talked about property interests. And even as to the car, said when you put something on a car, it's a form of trespass, even though most of us wouldn't consider it as such. And the purpose of my concurrence really was to say, you know, property is part of what, invasion of property is part of what makes for a Fourth Amendment violation. It's not only about privacy, it is about expectations of privacy more generally, so that it wouldn't matter, for example, whether you actually put something on the car and committed a formal trespass, or whether you could do the exact same thing with techniques that didn't involve a trespass on property. And this is not a new concept. You know, this goes back to Louis Brandeis, who looked at wiretapping and said, look at this, you can do wiretapping without invading anybody's property interests, but you get the same thing, and you invade privacy, and you invade, you know, what makes the prerogatives of a person over their own stuff in the same way.
Next up, we'll hear more from Professor Rosen as he debates fellow law professor Tim Wu on this question: is privacy paramount, or should we live in a transparent society?
This is the perfect time to have this debate. The degree of public surveillance these days seems to be unprecedented. There are CCTV cameras, sensors collecting location information on smartphones and other sorts of devices, and even future surveillance by flying drones or the Internet of Things, where your dishwasher will be able to tell whether you sent them a communication and relay that back. And we may soon be at a point where all of our public movements are recorded and stored. Is this a good or bad thing? Should we have any expectations of privacy in public places? Do we need to buy what today's New York Times fashion section called stealthware to be able to evade detection?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here debating my old friend Tim Wu. And I'm especially delighted to be on the pro-privacy side of this debate because, ladies and gentlemen, I am determined to convince you that, of course, we have some expectation of privacy in public places, and to the degree that Tim says otherwise, he is unconvincing. So you described some of the surveillance technologies that we're now facing. Flying drones that could track us from door to door. Soon, Google Glass will record our conversations, and we'll have to decide ahead of time whether a particular encounter is on or off the record, as well as existing camera footage from publicly and privately owned cameras and smartphones. I was at a conference at Google just a few years ago, 2007, and the head of public policy said he imagined very soon Google and Facebook will be asked to unite all of these surveillance feeds and to archive and store them and put them live online. If Google and Facebook did this, then you could zoom on a picture of anyone in the world, say me, back-click on me to see where I was coming, in this case, lunch in town, forward-click to see where I'm going after the panel, and basically have 24/7 ubiquitous surveillance of anyone at all times. Would this violate my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures of my person and electronic effects? Of course it would. How could it not?
It's my turn, and it's also a pleasure to be here with my long-standing friend, Jeff Rosen, who I've seen wear many hats, but not a tinfoil one before. So this is the first time I've seen that. So I just want to make a few points. Now, one of the things that's sort of lacking from this whole discussion is that a lot of what you're referring to as surveillance is actually things that people have voluntarily gotten into. You're talking about Google and Facebook and so forth. You know, people have evidently chosen to sign up for Facebook and tell everyone about themselves because they think that's what they want to do to maintain their friends and family relationships. People sign up for Gmail because Gmail gives this enormous free email service, which people seem to like. And so a lot of what you're talking about is actually the actions of independent citizens who have decided what to do. And you're sort of trying to impose on that and saying, you know, these are going beyond what people should do, which is paternalistic. I think that people can choose for themselves whether or not, and you're not a paternalistic person, so I don't know why you would want to have people choose themselves. One thing, the way I've done research for this panel is have gone to many of the parties here and talked to people about their preferences, and the only thing you can really say that is true about privacy is that people vary dramatically very dramatically in what their privacy preferences are. There was a gentleman who shall go by the name of Rex, to protect his privacy, he said to me, and I was like, we're talking about privacy, he said, I don't care if everyone knows who I sleep with, what kind of drugs I take. Why should the government be interested in that? They don't care. They can know whatever they want. I really don't care. It's not going to affect my career. I don't care. So that's sort of one extreme. He said, anyone can know anything they want. He said, I don't want my girlfriend to find it out. But this is his opinion. And there are people like that. There are other people whose position is very clearly that they don't want anything known by everyone. They want to have a very strong sphere of privacy for themselves. And I think that's right. And what I'm trying to suggest is we need a framework where Americans can choose for themselves the kind of privacy they want, as opposed to sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to have bans on, have very tight bans on how much surveillance is allowed. There needs to be this power in public spaces to have more surveillance, as long as we maintain a private space as well. And what Jeffrey hasn't talked about is the fact that even though he's worried about all his public stuff, we have maintained this private space inside your house where you're free to take off your clothes and dance around or do whatever you want. Whatever you want, you can do in that private space. In the public space, you should understand that as a society, we have certain public demands that demand that we will have greatly diminished privacy in the public space. So that is a trade-off. The decisions you're talking about, like the tracker decision, the justices actually did say that was a violation of privacy. So the Supreme Court is in the process of trying to adjust this line between public and private at all times. So we have a system that is more or less working, so I don't see what you're complaining about.
Is
Can I
alignment?
respond?
Sure.
Let's just make sure the issue is joined. The position you just heard is that whenever you go out in public, it is permissible for the government, not the private sector, to say, take a drone and put it on you and track you 24/7 from door to door for a month. That is the position Tim Wu has raised. And he's claimed it's paternalistic to stop you from doing that because you'll voluntarily do that because you turn over your email to Facebook. I would like to just start this debate with a constitutional vote, just a show of hands. Who agrees with Tim Wu?
Who agrees
that
the
it
question
would be
wasn't phrased
permissible?
correctly?
Who
says the question
you
wasn't
can
phrased
reframe,
properly?
you can reframe the hypothetical, but this is I want
Jeff,
to.
in fairness, I think we should draw a line here.
Well,
the line may but hold on one second. The line may be between comprehensive tracking of an individual and incidental capture of information through a surveillance camera or otherwise. I mean, if you think about the London Underground, for example, after IRA terrorism in the 1970s and early 1980s, the London Underground decided to put surveillance cameras in every station. They proved to be very useful after an al-Qaeda terrorist attack in London, and the cameras are visible. It's not the sort of thing that comprehensively tracks people, but it takes photos in places where there are particular security risks. Do you agree that that's a reasonable limitation on your right to be private in public spaces?
I will answer that question as soon as I get an answer to the one that I raised, which is we're not talking about targeted surveillance, which raises other questions that I'll talk about in a moment. Tim made the claim, he said it was paternalistic to prevent any tracking, comprehensive tracking in public places for a month.
That's not exactly what I said. I said that when you have excessive rules on private companies and their collection of information, that those end up being paternalistic when Americans have very different preferences as to how much information they want to share.
Okay, well, if you don't embrace it, I want to see if anyone in the audience does, just to make sure what the parameters of debate are. Who agrees with the proposition that the government should be able to take a drone and follow you without suspicion, door to door, in all of your movements in public spaces, 24/7 for a month? Who
Your
thinks
own
that would
private
be,
drone.
I'm asking the question. Who thinks that that would be consistent with the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment? I see two hands. And who thinks it would be inconsistent with the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment? Tim?
Well, if you want to boil everything down to a specific case, I mean, this is what I think is the real problem with this debate, is once you put the case, like, for example, should we have CCTV cameras which are running but not being viewed by anybody, and then those are used to find the Boston bombers? Who thinks that was unconstitutional for that particular case, to analyze that data to look for the Boston bombers? Does anyone think that was an unconstitutional use of the government's power? Right, the cameras in the public. Cameras are in the public. Right, they're on the streets, and they're panning and they're collecting data all the time, which is sort of like your little drone. And so basically what you've realized, what everyone in the audience is, this is insulting the audience, but you have an inconsistent position, because you already are in that world when you're walking around and the cameras are collecting information. So it all tends to depend on what you think are the specifics of the situation.
I think it's helpful that we start this with a consensus in this room, and I think from Tim as well, that ubiquitous month-long surveillance without limits and without suspicion would and should violate the Fourth Amendment.
Right. What I'm trying to suggest is that when our answers are somewhat inconsistent because everyone put up their hands and said that they find that unconstitutional. Nonetheless, presented, for example, with the Boston bombing and the fact that we know that there's cameras on all the streets. So in fact, it's not quite a drone. A drone makes it sound a lot scarier. But there are these little cameras that are panning forth. And so you're already in that world. And then faced with an actual case where there was an actual people killed, real criminals involved, everyone's all of a sudden, well, of course, in that case, that seems completely reasonable. So it all comes down, and this is maybe where the details all, to the specificity of what's going on. And so if you're walking out of your house and we have your imaginary drone, but we also know that you're the head of a criminal organization or that you are a terrorist planning an attack, and we have specific information about that, and it's the same situation, we're monitoring him to try and find out where he's going to meet his other contacts so that they'll design their plan. How many people think that would be unconstitutional to use that data? A few people. Right. With a warrant. Yeah. I'm talking about it with a warrant. And I'm talking about with a warrant.
With a warrant. Okay.
Yeah, I'm saying with a warrant. And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to what we're talking about.
Well, if that's all we're talking about, then we have no debate. Because that Justice Scalia, in his wonderful dissent in the DNA case, Justice Kagan,
no, I overstated. You're right. It has to be without a warrant.
You say without a warrant. Right.
Yeah. It has to be without a warrant. I'm saying without a warrant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the question is, do you have to have a warrant? And that's an important debate to have. Do you have to have some? But even without a warrant, you have some degree of individualized suspicion. You're not doing mass data surveillance of anyone. You have a particular suspect. So I would say about the Boston bombing, your intuition, were the cameras public or private, is important. And in fact, they were private. It was a Lord & Taylor surveillance camera, as well as iPhone footage voluntarily submitted by citizens. And there's something far less violative of the Fourth Amendment, which after all only binds the government and not private individuals, when private footage is aggregated.
We are in an era where all the boundaries seem to be shifting. And when the Fourth Amendment was written, it was relatively clear what a home is and where its boundaries ended. And so that you could support this relatively clear boundary. I don't know if I have an answer for every single question in these areas. I do believe sometimes when I believe in some instances, you are definitely projecting out. If you have, for example, a blog post, you have no expectation in the blog post somehow is private, you put it on the web, everyone can read it. And on the other end, I happen to think that Justice Department disagrees with me, that people's emails, even stored on servers, is still their private stuff, still part of what I would consider their home.
It's true the Fourth Amendment does require a judgment about reasonableness, and reasonableness reflects norms. But it is not true that the public is indifferent to mass national security surveillance. What was the one example of a case where the public rose up in outrage against a surveillance technology? This was the choice between the naked machine and the blob machine. And I love this story because it just shows what the future of surveillance may be. So right after 9/11, the government's presented with two screening technologies. The naked machine that shows contraband and plastics under your body, but also those graphic, creepy, skeletal images of the naked body. And the blob machine, which has the friendly sort of avatar with a baseball cap and a little thing that points to the place in your body that needs secondary screening. You'd think, given this choice between two screening technologies, both equally effective, one is a privacy Chernobyl and the other protects privacy and security at the same time, that the government would choose the blob machine. In fact, both the Bush and Obama administration chose the naked machine over the blob machine. And it took a political protest, namely that immortal cry by the Patrick Henry of the anti-body scanner movement, that guy who at the airport so memorably exclaimed, "Don't touch my junk."
Right.
That guy created a mass protest, and then the Obama administration went back to the drawing board, and they were shocked to discover they could, in fact, retrofit all of the naked machines as blob machines. And I'm now pleased to report that most of the naked machines have been shunted off to distant airports. I hope they're still not left at Aspen. There may be a few here. But in the big cities, we now have blob machines and not naked machines. That for me just sums up both the promises and pitfalls of this debate we're having now. In almost all of the technologies we're talking about, surveillance cameras, mass data surveillance for NSA screening, security screening, you can design the technologies in ways that protect privacy and security at the same time. It just takes legal constraints, technological will, and ultimately, Tim is right, a political commitment to insisting on the privacy protective technologies. And we'll see about NSA surveillance. I think the moment that some celebrity has their search terms revealed and leaked by accident, which is going to happen, there'll be an uproar and people are going to
But
demand the whole thing
I
stop.
kind of disagree. I think we're in a moment, and I've even been surprised myself, where we're looking at what is reasonable, and maybe because people have been conditioned to through Facebook and Google, or maybe because someone's always has an uncle or an aunt who take pictures every 5 minutes and is filming everything, where people have sort of gotten used to this and don't find it so unreasonable, especially at a metadata level, And if that's the case, if the sort of metadata or stuff, not the particularized, but the more blobby type of information people feel okay with, then we may be seeing a changing moment in the Fourth Amendment. That's what I'm trying to suggest.
Until the Obama administration, moved by the disclosures in these news reports last month, began to put out, I should say the NSA, began to put out information about privacy safeguards, which of course can't be confirmed. There really was almost no discussion of the program, first of all, and secondly of the safeguards. Would your views on this program be changed if there were a public set of safeguards that were issued, privacy safeguards, safeguards against secondary use of information, for example, if information about Americans' communication with an illegal gambling site or a copyright infringement site couldn't be used by the Department of Justice for other purposes, and if the privacy oversight was very clearly articulated, could this become something that, Jeff, you wouldn't be so excited about, and Tim, that you would be warmer about?
The answer is yes, absolutely. That's what I said in the last exchange.
But bear in mind that fundamental to this is collecting information from people from communications from people who are not suspected of any illegal activity. That is the cornerstone of these NSA programs.
Well, that's, I suppose, the trickiest point. You can certainly design a program that focuses on suspected terrorists, that doesn't allow the government to share the information with law enforcement unless it finds evidence of terrorism, that has minimization requirements, that does not allow suspicionless people to be looked at. The question of whether, not that we trust the government, but I suppose whether we trust the technology and the legal constraints on it enough to allow suspicionless recording and amassing of masses of data, because we're confident that that data will only be examined by a human being if there's some kind of suspicion, turns on a degree of our faith in technology and our faith in the legal constraints.
Why do you say our faith in technology? You mean you think that it won't do what it's supposed to be doing? So you think, for example...
It can't be hacked, for example.
Oh, I see. Are you saying that when you think the NSA thinks it's spying on foreigners, it might be spying on Americans? Is that your...
That's a separate
Right.
question, but just
Right.
the broad question of whether we can tolerate
Right.
mass data valence with the promise that no human being will examine the data without a degree of individualized suspicion. Look, you know more about the
Right.
technology and hackability of this
Right.
than I do. Would you be confident that that would actually remain lockbox?
Well, unfortunately, I do know more about it, and it does make me... Things tend to come out now and then, and so that is always something that I think government does need to be very careful about in these areas, even when we have this situation. I think it's a really interesting question as to whether you care if a robot is reading your stuff. It's just like the fundamental underlying thing is, when do you care? And this is something that's come up for all this NSA stuff, is who do you care about reading? And it goes back to my friend Rex at the bar, who only cares if his girlfriend sees his stuff. It doesn't care about government, doesn't care about Google. And people have very different sensitivities. Some people...
Well, Tim, think about all the people here who use Gmail.
Right.
A robot is reading all of your Gmail
Exactly.
emails to produce advertising. How many people are upset about that and would make you be unwilling to use? How many people who currently use Gmail, now that you've really reflected on this, are going to switch to another email service provider?
It's just so good. You get so much stuff. It's like
So cool.
it's a classic.
Yeah.
It's not cool. But
Sorry, go ahead.
You're right. It's uncool to say it's cool.
no, there's this really interesting question at the heart of it that I think we're examining now: is who do we care about reading your stuff? Is it, because as I said, robots read them all the time, and probably Google employees could, when they want to, sort of just glance over and see what's going on. I mean, I don't know enough about the internal workings of Google. They don't usually want to. They don't care, but they do. Government, and then you have these sort of foreign, these intelligence officials. And in some ways, an intelligence official, I mean, why do they only care if you're interested in terrorism. Generally speaking, they're interested in terrorism links. So maybe you don't really care if the government is reading all your stuff because they don't care about anything you think salacious. They just care about whether you're contacting foreign elements, and maybe you do care. I just think it's a really interesting debate as to who you really care reads your stuff. This is the trade-off of contemporary living. I mean, we just live in an era where we are in a much more fragmented society and therefore face different types of threats. And I've said over and over, I'm returning my thesis, this is why there's this phrase, get a room. In other words, like if you want, when you're in the public, you're going to be, and you're making out in public, you know, there is a risk this is going to become known. And I think, again, we have to figure out what that border is, but to say, you know, there can't be that border and everything's sort of fuzzily privacy defined just gives up too much from what we need to do in these times.
We are out of time, so last word to Jeff.
I just wonder whether we even need these public cameras. In an age when, in Boston, thousands of feeds were voluntarily surrendered by private cameras, Justice Brandeis, my hero, the great hero of privacy, was very big on the curse of bigness and the importance of individual laboratories of democracy. I think the idea of top-down CCTV cameras is 20th century technology, and if we are to have surveillance, maybe it is best to come from private individuals rather than the government.
On that note, thank you both for a really provocative discussion.
The debate on privacy versus safety is just one of the many topics that inspired lively conversations at the Aspen Ideas Festival this year. And you can see much more at aspenideas.org. You can catch episodes of the Aspen Institute Presents on worldchannel.org, and you can join the conversation yourself on Facebook and Twitter. From the 2013 Aspen Ideas Festival, I'm Jon Stewart. Thanks for watching.